The most successful financier in America wasn't a Wall Street banker, she was a widow. For decades, the financial establishment dismissed her as nothing more than a wealthy woman in a faded black gown. While America's premier banks chased reckless leverage and built empires on borrowed money, she quietly operated by a ruthlessly disciplined set of rules. And when the system finally fractured, those same elite financiers were forced to march into the shadows of a bank vault and beg for her help. Her name was Henrietta Howland Robinson Green. Newspapers branded her the Witch of Wall Street, turning her into a caricatured miser obsessed with saving pennies. But behind the sensationalized headlines was a financial mind sharper than any titan of the Gilded Age. She built her fortune on principles Wall Street considered outdated: zero debt, absolute liquidity, and cold, unwavering patience. So how did an underestimated widow operating outside the financial establishment systematically outsmart the men who believed they owned the world? The answer begins, not with a stroke of luck, but with a calculated legal maneuver executed 4 decades earlier. In 1867, when 32-year-old Hetty Robinson agreed to marry Edward Henry Green, a wealthy silk merchant who had made a fortune in the Philippines, high society assumed her wealth would naturally fall under his control. In Gilded Age America, the legal doctrine of coverture routinely handed a wife's property straight to her husband. Hetty shattered that expectation before walking down the aisle. She presented Edward with a binding prenuptial agreement, legally severing her assets, income, and future inheritance from his control. To the New York social elite, the contract was viewed as an outrageous breach of marital decorum. Under the prevailing legal doctrine of coverture, a husband automatically gained control over his wife's personal property upon marriage. Hetty's contract dismantled that doctrine in her private life, creating an impenetrable legal firewall between her capital and her husband's investments. It was a structural choice born of cold calculation. Hetty had spent her childhood in New Bedford, Massachusetts, reading financial ledgers to her visually impaired grandfather, Gideon Howland, who operated one of the largest whaling fleets in America. By age 13, she was keeping the fleet's account books. She understood a fundamental truth that the speculative tide of post-Civil War America ignored: leverage creates vulnerable empires. While her new husband dove into speculative railway stocks using heavy margin loans, Hetty quietly hunted for value where others saw ruin. Immediately following the end of the Civil War, the United States government issued millions of dollars in paper greenbacks and war bonds. Fearing national insolvency, Wall Street panicked and the bonds traded at pennies on the dollar. Hetty analyzed the federal balance sheet, concluded that the United States would honor its obligations in gold, and quietly bought up millions of dollars worth of distressed debt. Within a few years, as the nation's credit stabilized, she liquidated those bonds, turning her initial $1 million inheritance into more than $1.25 million in pure profit. Her core strategy was deceptively simple: maintain absolute liquidity, avoid debt entirely, and buy assets only when panic forced everyone else to sell. But in the spring of 1885, her financial independence faced its ultimate test, not from the market, but from the very institution holding her wealth. In May 1885, the respected Manhattan brokerage and banking house of John J. Cisco and Son abruptly declared insolvency. The firm had quietly allowed Hetty's husband, Edward, to accumulate over $700,000 in margin debt, which is worth nearly $23 million today, to fund his failing stock speculations. To cover his ruinous balance, the bank's partners committed a brazen act of financial piracy. They froze Hetty's personal accounts, seizing more than $500,000 of her private securities. They gambled that an isolated woman, terrified of public scandal, would quietly forfeit her fortune to save her husband's standing. They miscalculated. Hetty marched into the bank's offices alongside her counsel and produced the prenuptial contract signed 18 years earlier. Her legal firewall was absolute. When the directors hesitated, she did not plead. She threatened immediate criminal charges and promised to launch a public run on their remaining reserves. Facing an airtight legal trap and public exposure, the panicked directors backed down, unlocked the vault, and handed back her certificates. Retrieving her capital was not enough. Hetty delivered a lethal blow to the firm that tried to rob her. She packed millions in bonds and cash into a heavy trunk, hired a carriage, and personally wheeled her entire fortune down Wall Street to the Chemical National Bank. Word spread instantly that America's wealthiest female investor had pulled her money from the firm. Panicked depositors rushed to withdraw their funds, prompting a fatal run that bankrupted John J. Cisco and some within days. That same afternoon, Hetty confronted her husband. She informed him that she would pay off his remaining $700,000 debt out of her own pocket to preserve the family name from public bankruptcy courts. But she made it clear that their marriage was effectively dead. She severed all business ties with him, cut off his access to her fortune, and forced him to move out of their home to live at the Union Club on a strict monthly allowance. From that day forward, she stripped his name from her public identity, operating exclusively as Mrs. Hetty Green. Freed from her husband's speculative liabilities, Hetty turned her full attention to exploiting the structural weaknesses of the Gilded Age banking system. During the late 19th century, the United States lacked a central bank. When economic panic struck, commercial banks routinely found themselves strapped for cash as depositors lined up to withdraw their savings. Hetty recognized that in a crisis, cash was not just money, it was the ultimate strategic weapon. Throughout the panics of 1893 and 1903, while major financial houses were forced to sell off prime real estate and blue-chip railroad stocks at fire sale prices to meet panic demands, Hetty sat on massive reserves of liquid capital. She stepped into the market as the lender of last resort. She issued short-term mortgages and capital loans to desperate property owners and corporations, demanding prime real estate in Manhattan, Chicago, and St. Louis as collateral, while keeping valuation ratios at a conservative 50% or less. When borrowers defaulted, she seized high-value commercial properties for fractions of their actual value. To maintain total operational agility, she refused to lease lavish corporate offices on Wall Street. Instead, she established her primary base of operations directly inside the vault of the Chemical National Bank. Sitting on a wooden crate surrounded by sacks of securities, she personally reviewed every loan application, checked every mortgage deed, and clipped her own bond coupons to save the small commission fees charged by brokers. The press mocked her ruthlessly. Columnists claimed she ate cold oatmeal to save fuel and wore a single black dress until it faded to green. They even alleged her frugality caused her son's leg amputation after she delayed medical care. Medical records later debunked that rumor, proving she had taken him to top specialists across the country. But Hetty ignored the gossip. Her frugal, transient lifestyle in modest Hoboken rentals allowed her to dodge state personal property taxes, eliminate overhead, and hide the staggering scale of her liquid reserves from rivals. In 1902, Edward Green died after years of living apart from the wife whose fortune he had never been able to control. Despite their painful separation, Hetty returned to care for him during his final illness, closing the last chapter of their marriage. After his death, she adopted the black mourning dress and veil she would wear for the rest of her life, which prompted reporters to dub her the Witch of Wall Street. But behind the dark clothing stood something far more remarkable: a widow with complete financial independence, extraordinary reserves of capital, and no obligation to answer to anyone. By the time the panic of 1907 struck, her financial engine was running at peak efficiency. As stock prices plummeted by nearly 50%, and major trust companies collapsed under speculative real estate loans, the entire banking system locked up. Banks ceased lending to one another, and interest rates on call money spiked to an astronomical 60%. While JP Morgan worked frantically to assemble a rescue fund from reluctant bankers, Hetty walked through the financial district with complete autonomy. Over the course of a few critical weeks, she deployed tens of millions of dollars in direct cash loans to solvent businesses, rail networks, and brokerages that were temporarily caught in the liquidity trap. She did not charge predatory extortion rates. Instead, she lent money at a fixed fair interest rate of 6%, requiring absolute high-grade collateral in return. When major bank presidents stood at her desk begging for capital, she famously told them that she held cash precisely because she had the discipline to avoid their speculative games during the boom years. The very men who had barred women from setting foot on the trading floors of the New York Stock Exchange were now entirely dependent on a widow's personal signature to keep their firms solvent. When Hetty Green passed away in 1916 at 81 years old, her estate was valued at over $100 million. Relative to the size of the American economy at the time, that fortune equals roughly $2.5 billion today. Adjusted for the size of the national economy at the time, she was one of the wealthiest private individuals in American history, outranking almost every male financier who had attempted to outmaneuver her during the panics of the Gilded Age. Yet her true triumph was not merely the sheer size of her fortune, it was the complete disruption of an institutional system designed specifically to exclude her. In an era when women were legally constrained, financially infantilized, and systematically locked out of power, Hetty Green exploited the internal contradictions of Gilded Age capitalism. She understood that while the financial establishment built its influence on social prestige, leverage, and speculative excess, true power belonged to the person who controlled the cash when the system inevitably fractured. The legacy of the Witch of Wall Street remains etched into the foundational architecture of modern finance. Decades before formal value investing frameworks were published or central banking systems stabilized national liquidity, a lone woman operating out of a bank vault proved that disciplined risk management, absolute legal independence, and ruthless capital allocation could bring the most powerful financial institutions in the world to their knees.